Across the globe, 2019 has been a year of major protests. Demonstrations erupted over corruption, taxes, the climate, and much more, marking what experts say was a tipping point of ordinary people fed up with measures imposed by a ruling elite. From Paris to Hong Kong, Venezuela to Algeria, an outpouring of anger raged across nearly every continent, with millions rallying against their governments to tell their leaders this isn't good enough. Take the Yellow Vest movement in France, an explosive start to the year. Tens of thousands of angry protesters put on their gilets jaunes and hit the streets.
Parce qu'on en a ras-le-bol d'être mené par le bout du nez par un pouvoir méprisant.
What started out as dissent over a rise in a fuel tax in late 2018 gradually morphed into a broader campaign against French President Emmanuel Macron. But Macron has managed to maintain his premiership. Leaders in other countries didn't. In February, a financial crisis and widespread fatigue at the decades-long rule of President Abdelaziz Bouteflika sparked Algeria's biggest protests in more than 20 years. Within a matter of weeks, the old regime was gone. But that wasn't enough for Algerians, who carried on marching for months, calling for sweeping government reforms. And in Hong Kong, peaceful marches started in March over a controversial extradition bill by summer escalated into the city's biggest political crisis in modern times, lifting the lid on frustrations and a lack of full autonomy going back decades.
They say it's a fight for the future of Hong Kong, a fight that has grown increasingly violent, a fight that has continued to escalate.
Week after week, month after month, pro-democracy, anti-government protests rocked the semi-autonomous city, leading to thousands of arrests and constant clashes between police and protesters. Withdrawing the bill wasn't enough to stop demonstrators' battle for greater democracy and quell what has become one of the most defining movements of the year. Democracy was also on the lips of protesters in Venezuela. At the end of April, the country seemed to be on the verge of a historic military and civilian uprising against the Maduro regime. Frustrated over the country's years-long slide into hyperinflation and government corruption, angry protesters had been taking to the streets for months, backing young opposition leader Juan Guaidó and his calls for democratic change. But the months of protests largely gave way after a failed coup. In other countries, marches were contained to a one-day event. During the annual May Day protests, millions of Cubans took to the streets in a government-organized event to protest U.S. sanctions imposed on the island and its neighbors.
Cuba es de los cubanos que vivimos aquí, porque esta Cuba la hemos construido nosotros, no los cubanos que están afuera.
And Cubans were not the only ones protesting a foreign power. In June, U.S. President Donald Trump's official visit to London was greeted with mocking effigies and streets filled with thousands of peaceful protesters.
We're using this very powerful, humorous visual symbol for the general public to get behind, to voice their opposition to Trump.
Demonstrators objected to Trump's policies on issues such as climate change and women's reproductive rights. July ushered in protests of a less peaceful nature. Moscow saw the start of a summer of discontent, with tens of thousands of protesters calling for fair and free local elections. Police made sweeping arrests of demonstrators across the country, detaining thousands. And similar scenes unfolded in several other places throughout 2019, like Hong Kong or France, marking another pattern of the year as arrests became the norm in protests across the globe. At times, things got even uglier. August marked the culmination of 9 months of chaos and clashes in Sudan. After bringing down the brutal 30-year dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir in April, demonstrations continued to call for a peaceful transition of power to democracy. But that hope took a fatal blow when a bloody military crackdown left more than 100 people dead in June. By September, the country was on the path to a transition away from military rule. And if many strikes in 2019 were all about domestic issues in individual countries, there was one topic that resonated with people across borders and time zones. In September, millions took to the streets calling on politicians to address the climate emergency.
People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing.
Inspired by 16-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg, people across the world united to demand action.
As the end of the year drew closer, this wave of global protests didn't show any sign of slowing down. Instead, events heated up. In October, over 1 million Chileans took to the streets throughout the country, demanding President Sebastián Piñera's resignation.
The momentum is clearly here. We can expect that these protests are going to continue for a while.
And as protests went on, demonstrators resorted to sometimes radical tactics, setting fires to shut down the capital of Santiago's entire metro system and using lasers to fight off police. Protesters in Lebanon also put novel tactics to good use in October as they formed a human chain the length of the country. Like so many other movements, their months-long calls for government reform were accompanied by eye-catching demonstrations and violence. Month after month, the human costs of demonstrations in 2019 became more staggering. Hundreds were killed in Iraq in November, hundreds more in Iran that same month. Both countries have imposed internet blackouts that have hindered news of these death tolls from spreading quickly. Iran also closed its borders, hoping to stem unrest. In some cases, leaders stepped down and governments bowed to some demands. Even when concessions were made, they did little to take the wind out of these movements. The anger, frustration, and yearning for change stayed strong, with many more protests raging across the globe, from Bolivia to Haiti to Zimbabwe, to name just a few. 2019 might be remembered as the year people pushed for equality, justice, and autonomy with new ferocity, leaving powerful marks upon the world.